In modern times, mead exists as an exotic alcoholic beverage mostly relegated to fantasy video games and medieval tales. Before mead became the most prolific drink of Skyrim's 9 holds, mead was the alcoholic beverage of choice more than 1,000 years ago, and the language of Old English reveals the links between mead and power. Mead was most likely discovered thousands of years ago when hunter-gatherers drank rainwater from an upturned beehive. Unaware of fermentation and alcohol, they most likely drank the sweet water and experienced intoxication for one of the first times in human history. Pottery in China from 7000 BC has shown organic evidence of honey in fermentation, and in Europe residual samples have been found in characteristic properties from 2800 to 1800 BC. Several thousands of years ago, the people of Europe spoke proto-indo-european. Eventually, the Germanic tribes of southern Scandinavia language diverged from proto-indo-european, resulting in the proto-Germanic language. During this same time, the proto-indo-european word for mead evolved into the proto-Germanic word for mead. Proto-Germanic split into the East and West Germanic language families. The West Germanic language family was further subdivided into 4 groups: North Germanic, Ingvaeonic, Istvaeonic, and Irmanonic. Old English developed from the Ingvaeonic dialects of the northern German coast in Denmark, brought to England during the anglo-saxon settlement during the mid-5th century. Although there are other theories, the most supported theory of anglo-saxon resettlement postulates that the number of Germanic migrants was relatively few, mostly centered around the warrior elites. Upon settling, these Germanic people then spread their language and culture to the Romano-British people, eventually displacing it. Since the resettlement of the Anglo-Saxon people, Latin was replaced by Old English, and Old English continued to develop more and spread across the British mainland. During this time, the Old Proto-Germanic word for mead became the Old English word for mead. Along with the expansion of Anglo-Saxon culture throughout England came the clear connections between mead and power. A king would have ruled over his land from his mead hall, so the abundance of mead words in Old English is hardly a surprise. Through these words, we gain considerable insight into the place of mead in Anglo-Saxon culture, life, and social behavior. In Beowulf, an Old English epic poem, Beowulf defends the mead hall of Hrothgar, king of the Danes, from the attacks of Grendel, a vicious monster, and Grendel's mother. A village may have been called a mead city, or a rejoicing city. A warrior might take a trip to a mead hall to feast or converse with his leader. How would he get there, you ask? He would have likely walked upon the path that leads to the mead hall. During this walk he may even pass through the fields surrounding the mead hall. It seems as though a powerful life would be centered around mead. Once inside the mead hall, the vocabulary of mead would surround him. He would sit on a mead bench where he would engage in mead drinking with his comrades. He would have a draught of mead in his mead cup. If he consumed too much, he would become mead drunk, but if he consumed just enough, he would experience mead joy. Mead permeated the surroundings of a king, and thus became a symbol of power itself. However, as time passed, so did the popularity of mead, giving way to drinks like wine, beer, and ale, which were much easier to brew. Eventually, the language changed too. Old English evolved into Middle English, and Middle English became the language of choice in Britain since the Norman conquest of the mid-11th century. The French dialect spoken by the Norman rulers, along with the influence of Old Norse, both were instrumental in propelling Old English to Middle English during the High and Late Middle Ages. The Old English word for mead finally became the Middle English word for mead. Through the influence of standardization, technological advancement like the printing press, the Great Vowel Shift, and time, Middle English slowly evolved into the recognizable English we know today, referred to as Modern English. Finally, the Middle English word for mead became the Common English word, mead. Mead, as a word and as a drink, has stood the test of time, and now exemplifies some of the strongest abilities of linguistics, to give us a window into the culture, social behavior, and history of the many people who have come before us.